Hello, I'm Daniel Bryant, co-host of the InfoQ podcast, news manager here at InfoQ, and product architect at DataWire. And I recently had the pleasure of sitting down with Katie Gamanji, cloud platform engineer at Condé Nast International. Katie is a well-known speaker in the cloud native and Kubernetes spaces, and she keynoted at the CNCF's KubeCon Barcelona conference earlier in the year. In Katie's recent role, she has been part of the Condé Nast platform team that are building and maintaining a Kubernetes-based platform for developer teams to deploy applications onto. I was keen to understand some of the benefits and challenges associated with this, and also understand how important it is to enable developers to deploy applications via a self-service approach. I've also learned a lot from Katie over the past year about the Kubernetes Federation API and Cluster API, and so I was keen to explore these topics in more depth too. Finally, I was also interested in how the Condé Nast team manage traffic into and within their platform. I'm also pleased to announce that Katie will be keynoting at KubeCon London in early March. She'll be diving deeper into many of the topics mentioned in this podcast, and so this will be a great primer to her talk. Hi, Katie. Welcome to the InfoQ podcast. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, Daniel. Thank you for having me today.
As a way of starting, could you briefly introduce yourself to the listeners and sort of give a very brief overview of what you're doing for work at the moment as well, please?
Absolutely. So my name is Katie Gamanji, and I am one of the cloud platform engineers for Condé Nast, and I'm part of the cloud platforms team. And currently, at least the function I am part of, we are focusing very heavily on operational excellence, which means that we're delivering the way we deliver our platform and the way the platform is going to be used by our customers, so like our developers. So this is pretty much my day-to-day job.
Awesome. So I know that Condé Nast as a brand is global. I've seen from your talks, you put the maps up and Condé Nast is kind of everywhere. You have data centers in a lot of regions. I know you're using Kubernetes now as well, but before Kubernetes, how was this managed and operated?
Right. Oh, there is a very kind of long and kind of heritage question over here and response actually. To be honest, at the time, like maybe 20 years ago, like we had all our tech stacks being, and up to maybe 2 years ago, all our tech stack was quite individual for every single market. So they usually would outsource this to a third company. They would take care of the infrastructure of the platform, the way the content is going to be delivered to the customers. As well, it was quite an individualized way they will deliver their content. So the CMS tools, they were very kind of tailored per market. And this is not necessarily a sustainable way to move forward. This is what actually happened before. We actually had a pre-Kubernetes project where we actually wanted to move to ECS in AWS, and we actually migrated one of the market to that platform. However, moving forward, we kind of decided to move with a Kubernetes self-service solution. And I can give more background on why we decided to do that and how we transitioned to that stage.
Yeah, I'd love to hear more of that, Katie. That's something I saw you actually at KubeCon EU in Barcelona earlier in the year, and you were talking a lot about that motivation of why to go to Kubernetes. So what were the main motivations of a new platform like Kubernetes?
I think for us, the motivation comes from a very strange place, I would say, because we have to provide our infrastructure for countries like Russia and China. Now, these countries are quite challenging to provide infrastructure to. And what we actually wanted as well was to provide the same platform. We didn't want to create a snowflake in terms of infrastructure when it comes to China and Russia. So just thinking about these two countries, we're like, we really need something which is deployable everywhere in a way. So, or kind of has this kind of lift and shift capability. So because of that, we're thinking, if we run our platform on Kubernetes, what we actually need is just a bunch of VMs. Once we have the VMs, we can run our platform anywhere. So I think the major kind of motivation outlined from that thought, and this is the way we provisioned our infrastructure since. So at the moment, we are self-service in terms of Kubernetes. We do manage our upgrades. We do manage everything in terms of the life cycle, which is quite tedious, and definitely it's hard work at some point. But this is what we went for, and this is pretty much the solution which worked best for our use case.
Nice, nice. Is there any highlights that stand out on that journey to Kubernetes? Any particular wins you got early or any particular real problems you had to battle through with your team?
I think our journey to adopt Kubernetes was, I would say, smoothly, like in major lives. Obviously, it was difficult in terms of adopting Kubernetes and kind of having the learning curve of operating Kubernetes in-house, as well as making sure that our developer teams understand the reasoning of why we're using Kubernetes and so on. So these are like definitely challenges in terms of how can we have this tool in-house. But I think like the actual challenges in terms of like the technical point of view, they came further down the line. So actually adopting Kubernetes was fairly smooth. So we had lots of tools plugged in into it to provision our monitoring, logging, and the traffic management. Everything was actually quite good. But I think once we started to get more mature, once we actually had like more live traffic, because at the moment we're migrating markets to our platform. So the more traffic we had, the more mature our infrastructure got. We got into things like, oh, the lifecycle management of the cluster is actually quite challenging. We need to think of a way to do that. So we try to automate most of the upgrade process and so forth. I think one of the most challenging things at the moment is to keep up to date with Kubernetes and like the version of Kubernetes. Yeah, I think this is like taking a lot of our time, and we're trying to like really try to improve this with every single release.
Yeah, it makes total sense because you mentioned already you run your own clusters. And I think I've heard you say in one of your previous talks, you run what was CoreOS's, now Red Hat's, I guess, Tectonic platform. Could you break it down a little bit more?
Absolutely. So the way we actually provision Kubernetes, as you mentioned, we're using Tectonic installer. Now, this is a CoreOS tool, and currently it's actually to be merged with OpenShift container platform. It's going to make it difficult for us to provision future clusters with Tectonic, unless we want to fork this particular project and maintain it. I forgot the name, to be honest, but there is an actual team which actually does that. It's out there, it's open source, but they manage Tectonic as an extra fork. But again, moving forward, this is not necessarily the way we want to move forward, because I think at the time, with the resources we have, we are not in a place to maintain an extra project, and especially such a big project as well. So I think we're kind of starting to think of how can we deploy our clusters in a more efficient manner, and maybe moving forward, maybe changing the cloud provider we're using, because currently we're hooked in into AWS. However, moving forward, this might change in the future. So I'm not saying it will, but it might. So we want to have this capability of lifting and shifting anywhere. And like if you want to distribute our clusters, we would like to do this efficiently rather than taking weeks or even days.
Yeah, it could be a massive move, massive effort, like trying to lift and shift, couldn't it?
Absolutely. So we try to kind of optimize this in any way possible.
On that note, how do you get away with data stores? Because you can totally homogenize the commute and, like, say, putting containers on them. Do you use things like RDS, or do you run databases actually in the cluster itself?
Right. So I think this is going to be an easy answer. We do not. We actually do not operate any databases within our cluster. We have some, but not anything related to our applications. So all the applications are stateless at the moment. So we don't have the complexity of dealing with shifting data around the clusters. Well, in our case, at least.
Yeah, I think I heard from some folks that the data gravity, as they call it, is really challenging. Once you've got all your data in one cloud, you can totally lift and shift compute, but it's really hard to shift the data. Yeah.
Yes. I'm not sure if it's unfortunately or fortunately, but we don't have to deal this with.
Nice. You mentioned about sort of ways of, say, working with Kubernetes. The best practice way of working with Kubernetes or extending Kubernetes these days tend to be by the use of what's called custom resource definitions, CRDs. Have you or the team at Condé Nast created any CRDs that manage something that's specific to your workflow?
Actually, we do not. It's quite a popular resource within the open source projects. However, for us, it is not. And I think I have very good explanations for that. The way we deploy to the cluster is by having this global Helm chart that extends to different subcharts. To give you some context, we have our Helm chart, which is the base one, and it will deploy a deployment and a service account associated with that deployment. But then the teams will be able to enable things such as the service or the ingress or the HPA object. And this is done all via Helm charts. So it's so well abstracted from the teams. What they need to do is just a few lines of configuration. Actually, we don't have the use case or the real need for customer source definition at the moment. Everything is done via Helm. So this kind of enables us to, how can I say, to deploy to the cluster very easily without any kind of extra layer of customization on top.
Yeah, I'm definitely a fan of keeping it simple. Yeah, if you can do something with the tools, like Helm's a fantastic tool. We learned more about Helm 3, for example, at KubeCon NA this year. Fantastic tool. And if it works for you and it does all you need, it's all good. Why complicate it by adding extra layers, I guess? Yeah.
Exactly. I think for us, it's extremely important. Like, I cannot emphasize this enough. Extremely important to make it easy for our developers to deploy to our clusters, because they're our customers. It's not efficient to have a cluster which is kind of top notch with the latest edge technology if your developers cannot deploy to it. That's how we think, at least. And we really try to like abstract as much from them as possible, still giving them the context that they still know where the application is. It's in the cluster, it's in a specific cloud provider, but we abstract the deployment process in a way that is efficient for them to focus on what exactly they want for the application. So things such as like, I want this particular load balancer, which is restricted or public. I want this particular port, things like that, which is tightly related to the application and how the application is going to be served to the customers.
I like the way you said customer there. It's like if you're running a platform team, like your customers are the developers. Yeah.
Exactly. So, well, in a way, I'm trying to think this way because while you have a customer in vision, I think it's the way you deliver, it's a bit more kind of emphasized on like what the customer wants. So we don't call them customers, to be honest. I call them customers. Here we call them developer teams. So like it's how can we enable the developer teams rather than block them or make it more difficult for them. So yeah.
Yeah, totally makes sense. Switching gears a little bit, but somewhat related, I think, is I've seen you talk a whole bunch at conferences around the federation and cluster APIs within Kubernetes. So we'll approach them one at a time. With the federation APIs, imagine folks are familiar with Kubernetes, but they haven't really bumped into the federation API. Could you give us a brief overview of that?
Yes, absolutely. Federation is all about how can you manage multiple application and services into multiple clusters. Now, one of the most important points I would like to make about federation is it's about application management. So it's about resource management. It is not about cluster management. So this is quite a fine line I would like always try to kind of take across in any talks I gave about federation. So if you have a use case where you have, for example, multiple clusters and you deploy applications to those clusters in a very similar manner, then federation is a way to abstract the deployment process to one centralized mechanism. So you're going to have a federated deployment, which will propagate configuration to specific clusters. So it's actually quite a powerful mechanism as well.
So, how would the developer workflow differ if you're using a federated deployment versus a regular deployment?
With a federated deployment, actually, usually the way I'm actually trying to explain the way you use a federated deployment is that you add two extra points of information to your deployment. So you have a normal deployment with the same spec, nothing is changed there. However, you're going to provision two more data points. And there's going to be the cluster placement and the configuration overrides. So in the cluster placement, you have this kind of location where you want your application to run. So you say, I want this application to run in cluster which is in Tokyo, the cluster which is in Frankfurt, and North America. So you say you have a very declarative way to say where your application is running. And the second one, which is the configuration overrides, that specific thing is for you or for the developers to kind of tailor their deployment to a specific region or a specific cluster. So, for example, if you have more traffic in Tokyo for some reason, then you'll be able to say, oh, I want more replicas in that cluster. And this kind of configuration is going to be available in the overrides. So, I think this is kind of the main difference between a main deployment and a federated deployment.
So, extending your example with the Helm, you could imagine that being sort of a template too, and developers just customize the bits they want to change in those two data points you mentioned.
Absolutely. I think federation is great when application is very similar in every single region. Pretty much it's like same application, you have a pipeline which runs in every single region. There's nothing different. So maybe there's like a lot of use cases for that. However, if your application is like it's super, super tailored per region, then potentially federation is not going to be the answer. Well, it can be the answer, but the configuration overrides is going to be very tedious to manage. So this is something to keep in mind. Like federation, it's a very powerful mechanism when used for the right use cases.
Yeah, I've something it reminds me. Well, I've done a bunch of work with HashiCorp Terraform and other declarative configs. And if you start putting lots of kind of ifs and conditionals in, it's a sign that probably I'm abusing the tool.
Absolutely. So I think use it responsibly is the right way to say it.
Yes, with great power comes great responsibility. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Nice. So, if folks want to find out more about the Federation API, where's the best place to go? Is there a special interest group? Is there a website? Where would you recommend people go to?
So the main SIG, which actually is responsible for federation, is SIG multi-cluster. So if you search for SIG multi-cluster, you'll be able to see all the projects which are within this SIG. So you're going to have federation, you're going to have cluster registry, which is very tightly coupled with federation. It's pretty much a project that enables to have data about all the available clusters and the metadata necessary to connect to some clusters. A very important component of federation. And from all of this multi-cluster, you'll be able to kind of transition to different resources and different sub-projects. As well, I think this is kind of self-promo over here. When I actually started to work with federation, it was quite cumbersome to find the right quick user guide. How can I get started with my federation? So I've written an article about this, Federation V2, how to get started with it, which kind of gives a very comprehensive, like it's very straightforward, a very comprehensive way of where federation is useful, why it's useful, and then I have a very kind of small practical guide of how to get started with it. So a few command lines, and that's it. you have it working.
Perfect, Katie. I'll make sure to link that in the show notes because I've seen a couple of your articles and I'm sure readers will want to jump off, and like a quick start in this world is really valuable. So I'll definitely link that. Switching gears a little bit, so moving on to the cluster API. I think the first time I really heard about the cluster API was your talk at Skills Matter for the Cloud Native conference. And you did a great intro and I was like, this cluster API, I can totally see this opening up many opportunities. Could you provide a similar intro as you've just done for the Federation API for the cluster API?
Actually, funny that you mentioned that cluster API. I think it's a confusing name because most of the people think cluster API is about Kubernetes API. So it's very difficult to actually make that association of what the project does. But absolutely, in terms of the intro, cluster API is a set of APIs that kind of aims to deliver this common interface of how to provision, manage, and maintain your clusters in different cloud providers. Now, the emphasis I would like to make is this kind of interface because the way cluster APIs aims to work is to have kind of the same configuration, but if you'd like to deploy cluster in AWS or GCP, for example, what you'll have to change is pretty much one line of configuration in your YAML manifest. So it makes it very easy to kind of provision your clusters anywhere and kind of provides this common interface as well.
Interesting. So, what kind of patterns or opportunities would it open up in the future for people that want to use the Cluster API?
I can tell you my first time when I worked with Cluster API. So I was looking into it and I was like, it was announced in Barcelona, KubeCon, which was in May 2019. So I started looking into it and I was like, this looks cool, but like, what is actually in practice? And I was working with it, and half an hour later, I could provision in a very repetitive manner clusters in AWS that will take maybe less than 10 minutes. So I have a full-fledged cluster with master and worker nodes, fully working in AWS with my VPC provision, with my IAM roles attached to the instances, with all the subnets provisioned as well in less than 10 minutes. It took me maybe, let's say, an hour to get like all of this, like all the documentation sorted, like all the prerequisites sorted. But once I had that, I could have clusters going on and on. And the thing is, this was when I tried it as well, it was in its first release, so it was V1 Alpha 1, but they transitioned in V1 Alpha 2 in September this year. And it makes it even better. Like, honestly, like what they actually do, they have this kind of infrastructure reference, which I'm a very big fan of. So in your manifest, for example, you want to provision a cluster. So you have a cluster resource, but then you have your infrastructure provider kind of configuration. So what you have there is say, I want this cluster to be provisioned in AWS, I want this cluster to be provisioned in Azure, for example. And what you really need to change is just that one line, and then you're going to have your clusters everywhere. So to answer to your question, where exactly this is useful is, I think, if you are in an ecosystem that requires for you to create clusters efficiently, for you to create clusters in different cloud providers, but at the same time, you want to dismiss this kind of tediousness of configuring clusters in different cloud providers and having different Terraform for different clusters, or however you provision the clusters. Cluster API kind of abstracts that very nicely into a couple of manifests. And once you have it working, like, it's just beautiful. It's actually magnificent.
Very cool. Do you think this is going to lead folks to creating more clusters? Because I see a lot of developers now using namespaces, for example, one big cluster, bunch of namespaces. And that's good and bad. But I think as in having completely isolated clusters gives you more guarantees. Do you think we'll see more clusters being created now?
Honestly, I hope so. I think this is kind of where it actually moves towards. And it's creating clusters, but I think creating clusters everywhere. Because currently, if you're in a team, you can create a cluster just in AWS or just in this cloud provider. So like it's quite limiting. As well, if like as an infrastructure team, if you want to create a cluster, if you use a bootstrap provider, for example, for us Tectonic, well, yes, it will integrate with AWS and GCP. But if you look into COPS, for example, it will be supporting different cloud providers altogether. So just transitioning between these bootstrap providers as well can be quite tedious. Well, difficult as well. So I think what Cluster API is actually trying to do is creating clusters, and it should easily. But again, if you'd like to test, for example, your application into a new cluster, like isolated from your dev or staging or production cluster, you would definitely be able to do that with Cluster API in a very kind of little time as well. So I hope it's going to move towards that way. I think it depends on the use case. Maybe at Condé Nast, like we don't necessarily have the use case for every single team gets the clusters. I think that's going to be actually quite nice to see that we can provision clusters as a service where we abstract the way they deploy the application in such a nice way. I don't think that's going to be the case, but I'm quite excited to think about that.
Very cool. If folks want to learn more about Cluster API, where's a good place to go to?
Right. So there is a SIG called Cluster Lifecycle where they can go and find out more about Cluster API. As well, they have the Cluster API book where they have a quick start guide on how to get started to experimenting with Cluster API, all the infrastructure providers which are supported, as well as the Bootstrap providers. How can you do any migration between V1 Alpha 1 and V1 Alpha 2 if you're a cutting edge kind of adopter? If that's the case, there is a guide for that as well. And again, some self-promotion over here. I've written an article about how to get started with Cluster API. Again, giving a very kind of nice introduction in the use case, which is, I think it's quite important to understand where this tool is useful and in which use cases, and with a very kind of practical bit of how to get started with it in efficiently, like maybe 5 minutes.
Brilliant. I want to change gears a little bit now and get your opinions on some of the traffic management, because I've seen you, I think I've seen Crystal Hershon from your team, I've seen Josh Mickelson, I think also at Velocity Berlin earlier in the year, talk about ingress, which is a super important part of any kind of setup. You need to get traffic in from your users to your backend services. You use Trafic, I believe.
Yes, we do.
And you were recently made a Trafic ambassador. I think I saw you tweeting about this at KubeCon, yeah?
That actually was quite an interesting experience as well. They released the Traffic Ambassador community at KubeCon in San Diego, so it's quite new. I just was at their booth to say hi, and then, oh, it's a nice kind of coincidence. Yeah, so I think the Traffic Ambassador, they actually try to congratulate people, or kind of encourage people to be part more of the community, and especially the ones which are more traffic interested or like oriented. Yeah, so like it's all about that. But in terms of like what we're using at Condé, yes, we're using Trafic, and it's going to be the ingress controller which manages the external access to the services within our cluster. So it's a great tool which has a very big use case within our platform.
You didn't go towards something classic like Nginx, or obviously the latest hotness is Envoy. Everyone seems to be working with Envoy. You went with Trafic. What sort of motivations for going with Trafic over something like Nginx or Envoy?
So honestly speaking, the decision to adopt Trafic were kind of predated my time at Condé. So it actually happened around 2 years ago. So thinking about this, like Trafic at the time was kind of solving some of the problems which were very important for us. So it actually had a Helm chart. And I was actually looking at the history. For example, Envoy, they had a Helm chart if from like November last year, while Trafic has it from 2016. So this kind of difference is quite important for us. So I think like the Helm support as well, plugging into different cloud providers, because we kind of adopted AWS to be our cloud provider by choice. We had to make sure we can provision our load balancers, we can provision our security groups, as well we can provision our endpoints. So integration with Route 53. And Trafic could do that in a very elegant manner, very nicely as well. We're going to adopt a tool, but at the same time, we don't want that tool to make it difficult for us. All these prerequisites made it easy for us to kind of go with, yeah, this is the tool we want to use. And moving forward as well, for our teams to kind of configure the load balancers, because currently we have a load balancer for every single namespace, one which is going to be public and one which is going to be restricted. Now, on the restricted one, the teams will be able to configure by themselves who exactly should have access to that. So usually it's going to be like different engineers from different offices or different kind of endpoints. So they have a kind of whitelist. And what actually happens in the background, they just feed that to the Helm chart. It's just pretty much a YAML file. They just say, we want these sources. That's it. Now, what actually happens in background, the way Trafic works, is they actually going to have all these IP ranges or subnets. They're going to take it, they're actually going to put it in a security group, and they're going to attach it to the load balancer. So there's a lot happening in the background, but what they actually see on the surface is just that configuration file, which is very elegant. Honestly, it's very elegant to configure.
It's a nice abstraction effectively over the security issues.
Absolutely. So going back to my point where we try to make our team self-service, we really mean that in any way. Yeah.
That's very cool. Sort of on the theme of communication still, are you using a service mesh? Because everywhere I go seems to be service mesh this, service mesh that. Yeah. Is Condé Nast on the bandwagon?
We are actually on a journey. To give you some context, we actually merged with our US platform because historically there was a US platform and we had our Condé Nast International branch. We don't have the international branch. We're now one big company, Condé Nast. But a year ago, it would be like still two platforms. And now we kind of merged. We're at the stage where we have two platforms. They're super performant. They cover so many points that our developers need. We need to kind of merge them together. So I think moving forward, we're going to have this kind of converge of two platforms, but at the same time, we want to adopt the way we provision, like a new ways to provision our clusters and service mesh as well. So that's going to be on our list in the next year.
Excellent. So we do a podcast next year and ask what decision you made. Yep,
Absolutely. Yeah.
perfect. Lock that one in.
We're going to have a decision doc and everything. Yeah, absolutely.
Brilliant. So we're heading towards a wrap up now. I wanted to get your opinion, and I ask a lot of folks this question. If you are new to something like Kubernetes, which, let's be honest, is quite complicated, there's quite a lot of stuff that I'm sure you're steeped in because you've been building these things for quite some time now. What do you think is the best way for someone new to the space to learn about it?
I think this question has so many answers, but I think it depends on what kind of type of learner you are. So, for me, for example, I'm a very practical person. I really like to get my hands on and kind of go through all the resources and kind of try exercises and so on. So, for me, Kata Code kind of tutorials were extremely useful. They have a very nice tutorial where they take you step by step through different kind of instructions and they provision your clusters for you, so you don't actually have to think about cluster provisioning. You can learn Kubernetes straight away. I think it's a great way, like a practical way. Many people do that through videos. Many people have these different courses into different platforms. Anything works. I think there are so many great resources, honestly, and they're actually really good. And most of them are free as well. So the community is great. You just go on the internet and you learn from it. Yeah.
It's super good. The Kubernetes community in particular, I found super welcoming, super knowledgeable, and just it continues growing, which is impressive year on year. Like you've been obviously a big part of that, yeah?
I hope so. I really hope so, because one of my intentions is to actually grow this kind of awareness of the projects I'm talking about and the community around Kubernetes as well. But like even looking at the interest in the tool itself and the number of attendees at every single KubeCon, I was actually talking about this in San Diego with someone from the CNCF as an employee over there. And for example, in Seattle last year, there were like 8,000 attendees. Now it was 12,000 attendees in San Diego, and they're expecting 16,000 in Boston, which I think it's growing and it's amazing. Like I'm really excited to see like where this journey is gonna like go towards.
Yeah, ditto, same as me. What do you think is the biggest challenges for Kubernetes? Maybe for the tech, maybe the community. I'd love to get your opinion on what you think is the most difficult thing in the coming year.
That's that's actually quite a tough question to answer, because I think around Kubernetes there's a lot of projects going on in relation to Kubernetes. So there is generally a lot going on. For Kubernetes, I think to make its conception as a tool being extremely secure is going to be kind of the next step, in my opinion, because I think there are still adopters who are still kind of debating whether Kubernetes is the right tool, but most of their concerns are from a security standpoint. So, yes, it's a great tool, but at the same time, it's a great tool that kind of to run your workloads very fastly anywhere. It abstracts it in a very nice way. However, if something goes wrong the way Kubernetes works, it's going to propagate that wrong very fast. So, from my point of view, I think once they kind of make a very strong kind of standpoint, like it's kind of more secure if you do this and this and that, like a more kind of maybe transparent way of how to run it. For in enterprises such as banks, for example, they still kind of debating that very vividly. So maybe that's going to be one of the things.
On that note, I don't know if you saw Ian Coldwater's keynote at KubeCon San Diego. She talked about thinking about it from an attacker's point of view, thinking about Kubernetes from an attacker's point of view. I thought that was a really good keynote. And I think to your point, it's really important. Security for the enterprise is like number one priority.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I think this is going to be kind of maybe the next stage, but I think there's a lot of projects. And like one of the things I've noticed as well is kind of this creation of interfaces for like different resources or different tools, such as like volumes and storage. You have the service meshes and even cluster API. All of them try to create this kind of capability to kind of use Kubernetes underneath. So that's kind of the norm nowadays. Like when you talk about in open source, like use Kubernetes, but the way you plug it into like different like storage or like service mesh is going to be the same. So I think this is going to be like, well, at least this is the trend I'm seeing, and it's actually quite exciting because kind of all unite for one interface, and the user actually has the power to choose what they want.
Awesome. That leads nicely on to an announcement we're hoping to release soon that you will be keynoting at QCon London in 2020, which I'm super excited about. And I guess you're going to be talking more about interfaces and Kubernetes and the Condé Nast journey. Can you share any other ideas of what you think you might want to talk about?
Actually, I'm still defining it, so it's a great opportunity. But I think this is going to be the main idea, how this kind of interfaces came to be about and why people actually contributing to that. Because currently you have big kind of major vendors, they're actually very vividly contributing to kind of these interfaces to be created, maintained, and managed. It doesn't necessarily make them the primary user for that specific, for example, storage or volumes, but they're still contributing. And I think it's quite interesting to see this kind of movement because they see the potential to enable the customers. So I think this is what they're trying to do. And I think this is actually what Kubernetes tried to do. Like it started from all of, you can run your application. It doesn't matter like on what kind of language it's written in, you can run it on Kubernetes. It's like that nice abstracted way to transition into something which is kind of higher level of, yes, you have your cluster, but supposedly you want to run this particular service mesh, you want to run it in this particular cloud. The way this is going to be done in the future, I think, is going to be so nicely abstracted and like so easily done that Kubernetes is going to be just like one of the things that it's running in the background, but yeah, it's going to be the standard. It's more about how can you customize it.
I am looking forward to that talk. I mean, I've enjoyed learning about the Condé Nast journey already from yourself, but I think this kind of thing, like the future of Kubernetes, getting pushed into the platform, I think the audience is going to love that. That is going to be really interesting.
Hope so.
If people want to follow your work online, Katie, what's the best way? You on Twitter, GitHub, LinkedIn, Medium? What's the best way for you?
I'm on all of them, to be honest. Yeah, I'm available on LinkedIn as well as Twitter if people want to follow me. As well, if you would like to read one of my blogs, I'm going to be available on Medium as well. I do write them quite often as well. And mostly on the new tools I'm experimenting with or the new practices I am exposed to. So please have a read at that as well. Yeah, GitHub as well. But honestly speaking, I haven't reached the stage when I'm actively contributing to Kubernetes. But once I am, I'm going to pop my GitHub username out there. That's going to be for sure.
Excellent. It's been really nice talking to you today, Katie. Thank you very much for your time.